So this is the last lesson in this series, lesson number 9 on the book of Job, Faithful Living in Times of Crisis. And the title of this lesson is A Christian's Response to Death and Dying. Kind of apropos after the prayer requests that we've had. Very sad for several families that are going through with or experiencing the death of a loved one. And of course with COVID, we get a lot of those type of prayer requests because many people have lost loved ones. Everybody remember who she is? In 1969, speaking of death and dying, in 1969, Elizabeth Kubler-Ross wrote a groundbreaking book on the subject of death and dying. And what was unusual about it, what was groundbreaking about it, is that she noted a pattern of behavior that dying patients exhibited as they approached death from a terminal illness, or they were grieving the death of a loved one. And she noticed that there were many things similar. In other words, people reacted to death in a similar way, regardless of who they were, their age, their socioeconomic situation, didn't matter. When it came to themselves dying or someone else close to them who was dying, they kind of reacted in a same way. And her 5 stages of grieving, based on that book, have become famous and often repeated in teaching people how to cope with serious illness and death. Just in case you're not familiar with these, the 5 stages in the grieving process: shock or denial, stage 1, she wrote about. Stage 2, anger. Stage 3, bargaining. Stage 4, depression. Stage 5, acceptance. Now, Kubler-Ross taught that people didn't necessarily graduate from one stage to another. A lot of people mistakenly think something bad happens, you lose someone that you love, a spouse, a parent, someone dies suddenly, and there's shock, and then shock is followed by anger, and then that's followed by bargaining, if only I was there, if only I would have done this, that's bargaining, followed by depression. Oh my, what am I going to do now? I've lost my husband, I've lost my wife, whatever. And then finally, acceptance. You accept the new reality that I am a person that does not have a spouse anymore. My life is not better, my life is not necessarily worse, but my life is surely different. That's acceptance. So people mistakenly think that you just go from one to the other until you get to acceptance. But we found out that that is not exactly the way things work. They work more in a cyclical fashion. For example, shock would be followed by anger, and then a bout of depression. And then there would come a measure of acceptance, after which a person would revert back to bargaining with God for more time, in case of terminal illness. And so the idea is that people tend to zigzag from one of these stages to another for various amounts of time until hopefully they will remain in the acceptance mode for longer and longer periods of time. I kind of compare this to a roulette. You look at movies, because I know none of you have ever been to a casino. You look at movies and they have the roulette game, and the wheel goes around, and the little ball, the croupier, whoever he is, he throws a little ball in, and the ball is bouncing, and it's in red 4, and it bounces to black 6, and it bounces to bounces, and it keeps bouncing around till eventually it finds one place and it just stays there. Well, these stages of grieving work like that. You're in shock, and then you go to bargaining for a while. You pray, oh God, if you give me just one more month till my daughter gets married, I just want to live that much longer. You bargain, and then you fall into depression for a time. And then you kind of accept your situation. Yeah, I think I can deal with this. And then you go back to being angry again. And the idea is that you keep bouncing around from stage to stage until hopefully you end up at acceptance and you stay in acceptance. And as I said, the idea of acceptance is not, oh, I have this whole new wonderful life, or oh, I have this terrible life. No, the idea of acceptance is, I now have a different life. Like the guy who loses his arm in an accident. He's still the same guy, except now he's a guy with only one arm. That's acceptance. There are just some things I won't be able to do anymore because I'm a man that only has one arm. So this is the primary model. If you ever go to a group, a support group or something to try to help you deal with certain issues, this is pretty much the model many of these are going to use to help you deal with your reaction to death or suffering in your own life or in your family. Now, Kubler-Ross, the one who wrote this book, she was not a Christian. And in later years, she saw herself as a sort of a medium, able to contact people in the spirit world, because she was famous because of the book, and she kind of began to delve in this type of mysticism. And much of her later writings were not taken very seriously for this particular reason. Now, I mention this about her because it confirms in my own mind the fact that she did not use the Bible as a model for her death and dying theories. If she would have done so, she would have discovered a similar model to the one she observed in people. However, she would have discovered a much more complete and satisfying response to death and dying. And that is, the response of a believer to death and dying is different than what she wrote about. Very different. So as a human being, a believer's response to his or her own terminal illness or the death of a loved one is the same as any other person's response. However, because of their faith in God, because of their trust in Christ, that response goes beyond the mere 5 steps that Kubler-Ross described. Now, if we had to examine one person in the Bible who experienced both the threat of terminal illness and the death of loved ones simultaneously, it would be, of course, Job, the character that we have been studying the last couple of weeks. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on Job. We've already done 7 or 8 weeks, but we know his story. He was wealthy, well respected in his community for his goodness and wisdom and piety. He had a large family of sons and daughters. God permitted Satan to test him in order to see if he would be faithful in trial as he had been in abundance. Satan therefore caused Job to lose his wealth, his children, who were all killed at once, his reputation, and ultimately his health. It seemed that he had a terminal illness. He also lost the love and the support of his wife and then his friends. And so after all of these things had happened to Job, we read that he did not respond like ordinary people respond. In other words, he did not act like the people that Kubler-Ross described in her book. He responded differently than most folks would in a similar situation. Because in a similar situation, let's face it, most people would go into denial and shock, not wanting to accept the reality of the terrible things that had just taken place. Imagine losing all your wealth, your business and everything, and all your children all in the same day. Someone to whom these things would happen today would try to put the events out of their minds as soon as possible, as soon as the funeral was over. Life goes on type thing. I'm always amazed, I mentioned this before, at how quickly people begin to talk sports or light up a cigarette or start to gossip after the funeral service. Not a minute or two goes by, the final prayer is done, at the graveside service, and people are in a hurry to get back to normal because it's all been abnormal. This dead body has been there in front of them for several hours, and they've had to solemnly follow the casket in a car and watch the box with their loved one being lowered into the ground, in a conventional funeral, and then prayers are made, prayers about dying, prayers about heaven, these type of things, a lot of crying and sadness. They want all of that to stop. They want to get back to normal as soon as possible. You watch that. Next time you go to a funeral, you'll see that particular thing happen. As soon as the funeral's over, boom, people, it's as if it didn't happen. They're such in a rush to get back to normal. And what that is actually is a form of denial. But I digress. It seems that people want to get the grieving over with as soon as possible. They want to blame God perhaps, or question God concerning their tragedy. Why now? Why this? Why me? Why them? Now I've said all of this to make a contrast. Believers, on the other hand, are not most people. Their way of dealing with death and dying is different because of the cross that is behind them, the Spirit that is within them, and the future that is before them. An example of this is Job's response to the loss of his wealth and children and position all in the same day. In the book of Job, chapter 1, we see the 5 steps that this believer went through in his experience of death and dying. And I thought in the last lesson that we have on the book of Job, I wanted to compare Kubler-Ross's system of grieving, death and dying, and the Bible's system of death and dying, describing a believer who goes through this particular experience. So let's do that, shall we? The 5 steps that the believer went through, Job, the believer, went through in his experience of death and dying. Step number 1, he mourned. He mourned. In Job chapter 1, verse 20a, it says, "Then Job arose and tore his robe and shaved his head." Job immediately begins to lament the loss of his children as well as the other good things that he has enjoyed and now has lost. Note that he accepts as true the events that have befallen him. He tears his robe, he shaves his head, he falls to the ground. These are all natural and human, and at that time, normal cultural responses to terrible events taking place. This is the natural, healthy way to deal with tragedy. It's called lamenting. It's called the mourning. In some cultures, people wear black for a year after the passing of a loved one. And we think in the West, we think this is silly, or we think it's old-fashioned. But actually, it's a good way to separate oneself from a time, for a time of reconstruction emotionally, reconstruction socially and spiritually. Dressing all in black says, don't mind me, I'm in mourning. I'm going through something. It's a signal to other people that I'm being put back together again. I remember my own dad, when his dad, like when my grandfather died, I remember my father wearing a black band. I remember he had a gray suit and he had the black band at the funeral. And in those days, people wore a black tie or something like that. But anyways, he wore a black band. And I thought, as a kid, he'd take it off as soon as he got home. No. He wore that black band for months and months after my grandfather's funeral. It was a way of saying, I'm mourning. I've lost someone. I'm not me. Something has happened and I'm just not myself. It was a way to signal to other people to give me some space, understand, try to understand what I'm going through. And of course in the Italian community that my father lived in and that we were close to, there were no need for explanations because everyone understood what was taking place. The worst detriment to recovery from tragedy is to force a time limit for ourselves to get over it. Some people think they're helping others when they're saying to them, just get over it. People die, what are you going to, just get over it. It's like there's like a time limit on getting over losing someone that you love, losing a spouse that you've had your whole life with. We've had people in this church who've been married 60, 70 years, 80, it's incredible. You just don't get over that in a day, in a week. I don't think you actually ever get over it, so to speak. The worst thing that we can do is to try to force people to rush their mourning. If you don't weep, if you don't mourn when it happens, then you will weep and you will mourn later. I guarantee that. I guarantee it. Many depressions and anxieties are the result of improper time and effort given over to mourning and to lamenting the loss of a loved one, the loss of a marriage, the loss of good health, the loss of a family situation, the loss of an ability. You know who are the worst at this? Boys. Boys are the worst at mourning. We don't teach them how to do it. We teach them exactly the opposite. I remember the night that my own father died, suddenly, at supper time he was fine, he was laughing and joking and this and that, and he went out, and then at 2 o'clock in the morning my mother woke me up and she said, Daddy's sick, something's wrong. So I went over and he was dying of a heart attack, just like that, from one day to the next. And so we called the cops. I remember in those days there was no 911, you call the police, and they took their time. And then the police came and they went, yep, oh yeah, it looks serious, we better call an ambulance. And so they called an ambulance, to come and get the body. And they covered over, they covered him over with a sheet, and they put him on the gurney, and they were wheeling. And we lived in a small little apartment, we were sitting there watching them do all of this, and I was looking at my dad, and I remember I started to cry. Well, I was 15 years old, what are you going to do? I started to cry and I started to weep, and this big old cop behind me, he put his hand on my shoulder all of a sudden. And he said to me, stop crying. You're the man now. You're the man in the house, because I was an only child and it was just me and my mother. So don't cry, he said. And I didn't. I didn't cry there. I didn't cry at the funeral. I didn't cry when they buried him. I didn't cry for 15 years. And I'm not unusual in that. Boys are taught to repress their feelings. They're taught that they mustn't show those things many times. Girls cry, sure, oh, there are girls here. You want a box of Kleenex? Go ahead, let's cry some more. But boys, we don't let them do that. And that's the worst thing that we can do for boys. So getting back to Job, mourning was all Job could do at this point. And he did it as a way of saving his sanity. It's what God permits us to do. It's what God has hardwired us to do to save our sanity when things like this happen. And so in the believer's response to death and dying, step one, mourning, lamentation. Step number two, worship. Worship. In verse 20b it says, and he, meaning Job, and he fell to the ground and worshiped. He said, naked I came from my mother's womb, and naked I shall return there. The Lord gave, the Lord has taken away. Blessed be the name of the Lord. I know he's externalizing his feelings, but he's doing it in a worshipful way. As a believer, once Job could struggle to right himself from the shock, his first thought is to go to God in worship and prayer. It is unfortunate that so many see prayer as a last hope, as a grasping at straws when things go bad, instead of worship. Tragedy leads many people instead to drink, or to drugs, or to excessive eating, or abuse of themselves in various ways, or all kinds of escapist methods to deal with the great pain associated with death and dying and suffering and loss and all of that. Of course, the verse here in Job does not contain all that he said. It doesn't repeat for us every prayer that was uttered. Rather, we are given the conclusion of his worship and talking to God. We read about the insight that he first gains as a result of his prayers. Initial prayer or worship does not always produce such deep insights into the nature of our situation, such clarity about its meaning. However, when the thought of existing one more minute on this earth is too painful to bear, the only place we can and should go to is God in humble worship, in prayer. In my own life there's prayer, which I do on a regular basis. I try to discipline myself to do it on a regular basis. And then there's prayer with me kneeling down. I don't always kneel down when I pray. But I guarantee you there are some times, and there have been times in my life, when kneeling down was the only way to pray, because the burden was so heavy. If trouble, pain, and death don't drive us to our knees, what will? Many times God uses tragedy as a means to draw us nearer to Him than we ever have or could have been before. Our perhaps terminal illness or the death of a loved one is beyond our understanding. It's beyond our power. It is a supernatural thing that is at work in our lives. It's like being strapped into a roller coaster where we feel powerless to affect anything happening to us and our feelings. The thing about a roller coaster is that, isn't it? They strap you in and you have no power. It jerks you up, it takes you down, it spins you around, and you scream and you yell. But at the back of your mind, you know this is going to be over in 38 seconds. But there are some situations in life that feel like a roller coaster, but the difference is you don't know when this roller coaster is going to stop. For this reason, we need to come closer to the one who does have the power to control all things, including death. This may not change the circumstances, but it does bring us peace, and at times it does bring us a certain understanding. Job did this, and although his situation did not change, through his tears, he was rewarded with a crystal clear understanding of the true nature of his life and its ultimate meaning and substance. And so for the believer, the process, number one, mourning, realizing the terrible thing that has happened, whatever it is, and mourning over it. 2, prayer, devoted prayer. Number 3, silence. Silence doesn't sound like a thing to do, but it's a very important thing to do. In verse 22, it says, through all this Job did not sin, nor did he blame God. Although later on Job did break his silence, his first and his correct impulse was to hold his peace and contemplate his situation and wait upon the Lord. Here it's understood, he didn't sin, he didn't blame God, he didn't start talking, he didn't start whining, he didn't start blaming. The Bible explains this by saying that Job didn't complain to or blame God. He didn't charge God foolishly. He didn't question God as to the timing or the fairness or the degree of suffering. Who are we to question God about timing? Who are we to do that? He didn't dwell on the why of it all with the suggestion that there may have been a better way, an easier way, because many times when we say to God, why this? What we're really saying is, why did you choose this way instead of this other way? He did not substitute a plan of his own for what had happened that might have lessened the pain or the blow. He said nothing concerning the events and how they took place. The Bible says that in doing this, he sinned not. Kubler-Ross, she described the stages of grieving as denial, anger, bargaining, depression, and acceptance. And we've come to see these as the normal human progressions and responses to death and dying. But we should also note that for a weak and sinful person, these may be normal responses. However, think about it now. To lash out at God in anger, to question His actions, to try and change His decisions, to feel sorry for ourselves because of what God has done to us, all of these things are fleshly, worldly responses born out of our sinful and weak natures. It's only because of God's goodness that He doesn't zap us where we sit. When we lash out at Him in anger, again, who are we to lash out at Him in anger? The only spiritual reaction is the final stage, the one of acceptance. Compare these, however, with Job's initial response to death and dying. He mourned and lamented his loss, and so we see that within his very first reaction is included most of Kubler-Ross's normal human responses of denial and anger and depression. All of that Job did as he mourned. And then he drew near to God in prayer and worship. He didn't bargain with God. He bowed down before God in humility and trust. I watched my son discipline his little boy the other night. Just kid stuff, right? Kid stuff. And he needed to be disciplined, and he was disciplined right at the moment where he needed that discipline. And then in his innocence and humility, because it's natural for little children, he came to his daddy and came close to him to be reassured that everything was okay. The discipline's over. Daddy's not angry anymore. Daddy says, so you'll remember to do that. You know, yes, Daddy, yes, and I love you, Daddy, and I love you too. And this is what we need to do with our daddy. Not yell and scream and call him names. We need to draw near to him. And then, of course, he remained silent. During this time, he contemplated his situation and he searched for meaning. Many times, we only search for a way out. We only search for the pain to stop. We only search for the illness to go away. But we rarely search for meaning. Eventually, he developed, we're talking about Job, developed a life-threatening illness. And then he lost the support of his wife. And then he was condemned by his friends as a sinner who had brought all of this misery upon himself. These additional burdens led Job to the last two steps in the believer's journey through the experience of grief and dying. Step number 4, enlightenment. For nearly 40 chapters in an ongoing dialogue with his friends, we watch Job as he comes to grips with not simply the reality and meaning of his suffering, but the truth that stands behind not only his suffering, but the suffering of all men. Job learns that his experience is worth it if it reveals more perfectly the God that he believes in. In other words, if your suffering serves to give you a glimpse of God Almighty, then it is a small matter, and any complaining was foolish and sinful in comparison to what has been discovered and what has been given to you. Enlightenment, especially the enlightenment that enables us to see God more clearly, is of more value than what we have lost, whatever that is, however we suffer. Job learned that life as well as death is in God's hands, and the painful experience of it is justified if it leads us face to face with God. Even if it's just for a moment, that one moment is worth it. Makes it worth it. I've said to some of my closer friends that my own experience in being ill, and you know, the last year I have been ill with no understanding of what has caused the illness until just recently. And someone said to me, you know, that was terrible. The thought crossed my mind. You can have a thought that crosses your mind without seizing it and holding it. The thought that crossed my mind that I did not seize and hold on to was, you're wasting your life. Here's a whole year of wasted life. And I know that thought did not come from God. That was the evil one. And I remember in my prayer and in my own enlightenment, one of the things that I discovered was the goodness of God. I can't explain to you how suffering and the type of suffering where you see no end to it, how that suffering in some way reveals the goodness of God. I can't explain how this gets you to that, but I can tell you that it's worth it. It was worth the suffering to learn the things that I learned in this last year. You know, non-believers' best hope is to arrive at that point where they accept a new reality and they learn to cope with it. That reality being that people suffer and die and there's nothing that they can actually do about it except carry on as best they can. This is as good as it gets for the non-believer. Acceptance. It doesn't get any better than acceptance. Suffering and death for believers, however, brings them face to face with the ultimate reality, and that is that there is a living God who gives life and controls death by His power. The ultimate end, therefore, is that death and dying strengthens faith and hope and loosens its grip of fear and sorrow on our hearts. Only an enlightened person like Paul the Apostle could write these words when facing death. For to me to live is Christ and to die is gain. Only an enlightened person could write such words. He had seen beyond suffering and death and had a glimpse of God's reality, and it was worth all the suffering that he had endured. And then, step number 5, restoration. Restoration, Job chapter 42, 10-17, I won't read it, we know what happened at the end. In the last chapter we learned that God heals Job, restores his family, his wealth, his position. Of course, this didn't change the fact that Job had suffered and lost children and prestige. His suffering was real. You see, God doesn't give us our old life back. He gives us a new life, a different life. My own life is different than the life I had last year. Here on earth, it's a life that we can live and live with. Sometimes it's very different, sometimes it's harder, but for believers, it's always a life where God is more prominent than before. He is the reward for persevering through suffering, not good health. You may not have a parent or a child or a spouse or a loved one or health anymore, but you now have more of God to make up for it. And in the next world, the great promise for those who have experienced the enlightenment of suffering is that you will have all of Him all of the time, because after your death, you will leave behind everything that comes between you and Him. Your body of sin, your need to survive, your many sorrows, your earthly treasures, you will have none of those things. And because of that, none of those things will interfere in your relationship with Him. All of these will fall away as you are restored to the perfect relationship with God through Christ that you were originally designed to enjoy. And so Kubler-Ross explained how unbelievers face death because that's all she could see as an unbeliever. Job, however, describes how a believer responds to the death and dying around and in him. He mourns the loss. He draws closer to God. He refrains from sin. And note that in doing these things, God will then lead the believer into the final stages of the experience of death and dying, which are enlightenment, a fuller knowledge of God.
For every lover, in the depths of the darkest night, your love shines through, a guiding light. With every heartbeat I feel your grace. In your warm embrace I find my place. Darling, don't cry, don't shed a tear, for I'll be your fortress, I'll always be near. Though storms may rage and oceans may roar, I'll stand by your side forevermore. Through the trials and the tests we face, our love will endure, it cannot be erased. So dry your eyes, my love, and take my hand. Together we'll conquer.
And restoration, a deeper walk with God. It is within this cycle that we experience God's plan and purpose for our lives when things go terribly wrong. All of us will experience tragedy in our lives one way or another, and all of us will ultimately face our own demise. The only difference is that some will experience them as believers, and some will face these things as non-believers. We have no control over death, no control over dying, but we do decide how we will face these things. Will we face them as believers or as non-believers? As always, you have an opportunity to be counted as a believer this evening by confessing your faith in Jesus Christ and leaving your sinful lives behind, being baptized for all of your sins, the forgiveness of these, or if you've been unfaithful as a believer, of course, being restored to a faithful status with God once again. I finish with the invitation because it seems natural to invite everyone to be ready to face the inevitable death and dying that all of us must do so. But I so encourage all of us to face our suffering and then eventually our demise as believers. Because as believers, we see beyond this life into the next life and not simply an acceptance of this life only. All right, that's the end of the Job series for now anyways. Thank you very much for your attention.